Hello, I'm Jason Collings, and this is the Voices of the Weimar Republic, the city and the nerves. When people talk about Weimar literature, they often do it in a way that makes it sound like a shelf of books with famous names. Names like Mann, Brecht, Döblin, Kästner, Tucholsky, Roth, Isherwood. Important figures all, of course, but if you stop there, you miss what made their writing so alive. What those writers were responding to wasn't merely a set of ideas, it was a way of living, a pace, a strain, a nervous tension. And nowhere did this show more clearly than in Berlin. The old capitals of Europe had known elegance, ceremony, and vice before. Berlin had those too, but by the 20s it had become something more unsettling, something unique. It felt fast in a way older cities did not. Fast in the body as well as in the mind. Electric transport, telephones, newspapers, cheap print, cafes, rented rooms, clubs, offices, the pressure of crowds and money and being seen. In a city in which people were not simply living, they were being accelerated. That, I think, is one of the key feelings behind the Weimar writing of these authors. A whole generation felt that modern urban life had changed the texture of consciousness themselves, and the writers put it down in print. The old, broad, settled rhythms had broken down. People no longer moved through cities as they had through the 19th century. They were interrupted more, tempted more, observed more, jostled. They were more alone in crowds and more exposed in private. That's why so much of Weimar's writing feels nervous, anxious, edgy, not merely intelligent or satirical or even urban, although it's all of these, but nervous. It twitches, it cuts, it's sharp edged. It expects some kind of pressure behind the surface. If you take Alfred Döblin, he's perhaps the clearest example of this new sensibility, not because he simply wrote about Berlin, but because he wrote about Berlin through uh, the, that had altered the form of the novel itself. Berlin Alexanderplatz is not just a book set in a city, it's a city in a textual form. Snatches of speech, transport, signage, rhythm, interruption, voices talking over one another, fragments of daily life colliding without ceremony. The old, dignified, carefully balanced narrative gives way to something rougher and truer of the age. That really mattered. Dublin showed that the big city wasn't just a backdrop for modern life, it was one of the engines shaping modern consciousness. And Berlin in the Weimar era was perhaps the great German example of that. Then there's Bertolt Brecht, who belongs to the same nervous republic, but in another register. Brecht doesn't give you the city as a sheer sensory bombardment in the way that Dublin does. He gives you its moral and economic wiring. He looks at the same modern world and strips away the excuses. In the Threepenny Opera, in Mahogany, in Poems and Prose, he keeps asking the same ugly questions. Who eats, who goes hungry, who profits, who pretends not to notice. He treats the city as a theatre of appetite and hypocrisy. And that too is very Weimar. The Republic generated enormous sophistication. It also generated a style of writing impatient with sophistication used as hypocritical camouflage. Brecht is one of the voices that tells you that this age is not only glittering and inventive, it's socially hard. And many writers knew it. Kurt Tucholsky belongs here as well, though he comes at the age through satire and journalism rather than novel or stage. His Berlin is full of masks, militarism in civilian clothes, stupidity dressed as seriousness, and nationalism pretending to be honour. His importance lies partly in tone. He writes with speed, anger, and wit, and almost no patience for comforting illusions. You can feel in him a journalist's awareness that public life is being shaped daily by language, performance, and lies repeated until they sound like common sense. That's another essential Weimar note. The awareness that modern public life is being manufactured in real time in newspapers, talk, propaganda, slogans, and the atmosphere of the city itself. That's one reason that Weimar writers feel so modern, so current. It's almost as if they're writing about what we are experiencing now. Eric Kästner gives us another side of that same urban pressure. He can write Berlin with lightness, as he does in Emil and the Detectives, where the city is dangerous but legible and children can move through it with wit and nerve and teamwork. Yet in Fabian, the very same Berlin becomes tired, brittle, and morally threadbare. That doubleness matters. Kästner knew the city could still feel exciting and clever while rotting at the edges. That's one of the great Weimar insights and runs far beyond Kästner. A society can remain amusing long after it's ceased to be healthy. It can produce jokes, sharp dress, good theatre, romantic confusion, and clever conversation as it becomes politically and morally more unstable and rotten by the month. Weimar literature catches that contradiction better than almost anything else. Joseph Roth is also thought of as a writer of loss, and he is. But he also belongs in this urban section because he understood something profound about Berlin and the Republic at large, that they were living amongst ruins, not always visible ones. He brings into Weimar literature a sense of civilizational afterlife, a world gone but not gone cleanly, a new order erected without deep confidence. Old loyalties lingering like ghosts in rented rooms and railway compartments. That's why Weimar writing often feels haunted even when it's brisk on the surface. The city is modern, the prose is modern, the mood often isn't. Behind the speed, there is bereavement. And then there is Christopher Isherwood, who arrives from outside. Isherwood was English, of course. And in some ways, he sees Berlin all the more clearly because of his outsider's position. He catches the boarding house city, the rented room city, the half lit, the improvisation and uncertainty. He strips away the official story and writes the social weather. The people not quite stable, not quite secure, not living at ease, living under a sky darkening by degrees. Outsiders are good at that. They often hear the note of strain before the insiders want to admit it. Even Thomas Mann, who stands a little apart from the most immediate Berlin street level writing, belongs in this section because he understood another part of the same story, that civilization and decay can live in the same sentence. In Death in Venice and in The Magic Mountain, the world is still cultivated, still articulate, still outwardly composed. Yet beneath that composure, one senses obsession, illness, drift, fatigue, and the possibility of collapse. Thomas Mann gives Weimar its high culture version of the same nerves that Döblin and Brecht and Kästner catch lower down in the city. So, what's the shared pattern here? It's not one ideology. These writers are too different for that, nor is it one style, though there are some familial resemblances. It's a common pressure. They are all writing in a republic, a society that is unstable but intensely alive. A republic full of speed, talk, argument, temptation, crowding, theatricality, satire, ambition, vice, collapsing certainties, and the strange excitement that comes when a future feels open and dangerous at the same time. Berlin is the symbolic centre of this condition, even for writers not reducible to Berlin writers in any narrow sense. That's why the city matters so much, not just as a location, but as a method. The big city taught writers to cut faster, notice more sharply, trust surfaces less, and assume that what looked bright might in fact be sick. It made them suspicious of stable identities. It made them attentive to class performance. It made them alert to loneliness in public and aware that politics could enter private life through newspapers, job markets, rented rooms, the joke half heard in a cafe. In short, it made them modern. And they in turn taught later generations how to write the modern city. That is their great long-term influence. They didn't just record Weimar Berlin, they changed the vocabulary of urban literature itself. The fractured novel, the satirical montage, the theatrical exposure of hypocrisy, the melancholy boarding house witness. The cultivated feel of a European consciousness sensing decay beneath refinement. These aren't small contributions. They helped shape how 20th century literature imagined city life and how literature still does. They also shaped how later generations imagined Berlin itself. The Berlin that survives in cultural memory, and almost uniquely in that memory, since the actual city was obliterated by 1945, owes so much to these writers. The Berlin of speed and seedy glamour and rented rooms and neon, of wit and exhaustion, of appetite and bad weather in the soul. This is not simply history. It is literature doing a historical job of work. And there's one more thing. These writers mattered and still matter because they noticed that what societies under pressure sound like before everyone else has admitted what is happening. They hear the strain in the joke, the fatigue in the conversation, the desperation in the flirtation and the falseness in the official tone. They hear a society whose heart is beating too fast. And that's why I call this first group the city and the nerves of the Republic. The city gave Weimar its pace, the nerves gave it its style, and the writers gave it words sharp enough to survive the collapse, words sharp enough to resonate all the way from then to now, when I think we ought to be listening to them again. That's why they still deserve to be read. Thanks very much. Subscribe for more.